Sites such as this were commonplace throughout Britain right up to the early part of the 20th century. But the history of milling at Worsbrough goes back much further than that. In fact, more than 900 years. Mention of a corn mill at Worsbrough is made in the Domesday Book of 1086. But the earliest of the present buildings is this watermill, dating from about 1625. It was built by the estate of the Worsbrough Hall, under whose ownership it remained until the late 1960s. For most of its working life, the mill served local tenant farmers and villagers, grinding grain for domestic baking and livestock feed. The presence of a fireplace suggests that the millers may well have lived here in the mill. And we've been left with another clue. These evenly spaced mortises on the underside of this tie beam could well be evidence of a substantial dividing wall which once extended right across this building, giving further credence to the live-in miller theory. Dating this, the earliest of the existing buildings, has not been easy, as no documentary evidence has survived, and there are no reliable dates on or in the building itself. However, three specific architectural features lead us to believe that the mill was built in the 17th century. The crude but substantial timber framing of the roof is typical of the period, as are the 3- and 4-light mullioned windows. And let's go outside for our third feature. Just look at the huge stone lintel over this door. The builders were certainly taking no chances, even by early 17th century standards. And there's something else I want to show you by the fireplace. There are some interesting graffiti marks carved into this fireplace, giving the date 1819. Now, as a half tax for West Yorkshire recorded 1/2 at Worsbrough Mill in 1672, the significance of this 1819 date can only be guessed at and probably signifies a refurbishing of the mill. The watermill was essentially designed for toll milling, a system whereby a farmer or villager would bring in his corn to the mill and the miller would grind it in a single batch and return exactly the correct weight of meal, less the miller's toll. This generally amounted to 1/16 of the grain brought in. Toll grinding to the miller meant an endless succession of small parcels of grain, seldom more than 1 sack for each customer, all of which had to be kept separate. Now, this separation was essential as grain quality would vary so much between customers, and because it was otherwise nigh on impossible to ensure that each customer received his own measure back. This would have been the bulk of the mill's trade right up to the beginning of the 19th century. With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, the working of coal and iron developed rapidly in the Worsbrough area. A canal and later a railway were built, which brought new industry, and with them, more hungry mouths to feed. In fact, between 1831 and 1861, the population of Worsbrough more than doubled. To meet the growing demand for flour and meal, the watermill was converted to drive more stones, which may well explain that 1819 date chiselled into the fireplace. Finally, this steam-powered mill was added to the watermill around 1843. Dating this building has been somewhat easier than dating the old mill. The surveyor's original sheets for the first Ordnance Survey map were drawn up in the spring of 1840 and show no signs of the new mill. It seems inconceivable that the surveyor, one Mr. Joseph Hall, should have missed a new 40-foot-high building with a 50-foot-high chimney standing next to it. So, in 1840, we can assume, with a fair degree of confidence, that the new mill did not exist. Not so in 1843, as an advertisement in the Doncaster, Nottingham and Lincoln Gazette testifies. To be let, the Worsbrough Water and Steam Corn Mill. The new mill was designed for a very different trade from the watermill. With its very large bin floor, it was definitely intended to meet the demands of merchant milling. The miller brought the grain from the grower via the local corn exchange, stored it, processed it, and then sold it as meal or as flour to the local bakeries. By the start of the 20th century, conditions in the milling industry had changed radically. The development of roller milling, the demand for cheap, pure white flour, and the increasing dependence on imported wheat led to the growth of huge new mills at the ports and near large urban conurbations. By around 1900, the new mill had ceased to work, and in 1922, when the new owners took over, the steam engine was removed and the old boiler house knocked down. Now let's take a closer look at the actual machinery at Worsbrough. We'll start in the old mill. The power comes from the head of water maintained here in the mill pond, which is filled through an 800-yard man-made channel bringing water from a natural stream, Rockingham Dyke. Now let's take a look at the wheel which converts this head of water into usable power. The current wheel is made of iron. It's over 14 feet in diameter and it weighs almost 7 tons. It's overshot, which means that the water from the mill pond comes in at the top, collects in these buckets around its edge, and then the weight of the water in the buckets turns the wheel. But there's something else I want to show you on top of the wheel. The present wheel was fitted in about 1864 and superseded a slightly smaller one, probably made of wood. The earlier wheel, or one of its predecessors, had been running so out of true that it badly scored the wall behind the wheel, as you can see. So the wheel harnesses the power of the water, which is transmitted to 3 sets of millstones on the floor above through this typical gear arrangement. The gears also increase the rotational speed of the stones by a factor of 10 over the slow-running water wheel. Originally, the wheel would have driven only 1 pair of stones until the present system was installed in the 19th century. The stones themselves are quite works of art, and when you take into account the, by today's standards, primitive manufacturing and dressing methods, they were high-precision pieces of equipment. In common with many water and windmills, the stones at Worsbrough, in both mills, are of 2 types: millstone grit, or greys as they were commonly called, and the much prized French burrs. The greys were manufactured from the local Pennine millstone grit and eventually used predominantly for the grinding of animal feeds. The French stones were formed from segments of a very hard freshwater quartz, quarried in the Paris Basin and bound with iron hoops. They were obviously very expensive pieces of equipment in their time and were used principally for producing wheat flour. Further up the substantial main shaft is this crown wheel, from which power is taken off through a series of line shafts to drive grain cleaning and flour refining machinery, and also the sack hoist. As the whole processing operation was essentially gravity-fed, the first priority was to get the grain to the top floor. Simply operated through a slack belt clutch, the hoist uses the power of the water wheel to lift the sacks with ease through the trapdoors on each floor to the top of the building. The steam engine which originally powered the new mill is thought to have been a Watt-type beam engine, but little evidence remains today. Only the girders which supported the original beam are left. In place of the original beam engine, visitors now see a Hornsby hot bulb engine, which was rescued from the scrapyard and brought to Worsbrough in 1973 as part of the restoration programme. Built in 1911, this oil-fueled engine worked as an auxiliary engine in the Syke House windmill near Thorn, where it provided power on windless days. The new beam engine drove a lay shaft rather than a spur wheel arrangement as in the old mill, enabling the stones to be sighted in a straight line and not clustered round an upright shaft. This gives more working room on the stone floor and a far simpler arrangement of the spouts on the floor below. The flour milling process you can see today at Worsbrough is very similar to that carried out in the late 19th century, when both mills would have been working hardest. Sacks of grain from the farms are wheeled into the mill off the ramps outside the bottom doors, and then hoisted to the top of the mill for storage until needed. But before milling, it has to be cleaned. Mixed in with the grain are quantities of dust, soil, straw, chaff, sticks, stones, weeds, seeds, even dead insects. Anything that gets caught up in it whilst it's in the field or while being stored on the farm. And these all have to be removed before the wheat can be milled. The sacks of dirty wheat are hoisted again to the top floor and tipped into a hopper above the cleaner. A series of sieves removes from the wheat anything larger or smaller than the grains themselves. The wheat is scoured and polished by rapidly moving metal beaters, and then while it drops down the spout into the sack below, a fan sucks away any dust and light rubbish that might still be mixed with it. The clean grain is now ready for grinding and is poured from the sack into the hopper above the millstones. Millstones work in pairs, but only the top one, the runner stone, revolves. The drive shaft to the runner stone is brought up through the centre of the stationary bedstone from the gears below. From the hopper, the grain runs into the eye of the runner stone, down a shallow wooden trough or shoe to ensure an even feed. The shoe itself is supported by the crook string, which, when lengthened or shortened from below, increases or decreases the gradient of the shoe and so controls the quantity of grain feeding into the eye. The grain is ground between the stones as it moves outwards, emerging as meal at the edge. The meal then falls down the spout to the ground floor, where it is either run straight into bags or collected in a large box or meal ark. Millstones work by a combination of shearing and grinding. And even though the stones appear heavy and cumbersome, they must be cut or dressed with accuracy to work properly. The grooves or furrows are cut to a traditional pattern and help to draw the grain out from the centre and up to the flat grinding surfaces or lands. When the stones are working, the furrows perform a scissor-like action on the grain and are also supposed to pull air into the stones to keep the meal cool. The lands must be kept abrasive, and on the wheat stones this is done by cutting parallel cracks in the stone like the teeth of a file. Skillful millers could cut 16 cracks to the inch. Millstones should never touch, and the gap between them can be altered by raising or lowering the runner stone shaft by working a lever on the ground floor. When wheat is ground by millstones, wholemeal is produced. As we know, this makes a brown loaf with a dense texture. However, the taste of the Victorians, as for many people today, was mainly for white bread, and this meant that the wholemeal had to be refined to extract the fine white flour. The bags of wholemeal are hoisted to the top of the mill and discharged into another hopper. It's fed down into this machine then, where it's brushed against a fine wire sieve. The white flour filters through and drops into a sack below. But the coarser parts of the meal, including the brown outer skin of the grain, or bran, fall down that second spout into another sack to be used as animal feed. In its day, Worsbrough Mill was probably typical of many similar mills throughout the country, but it is, however, quite unusual from one point of view, that on one site we can illustrate 350 years of stone milling history using 3 types of power: water, steam and oil. But more importantly, it works today. We can still see the splash of the water wheel and hear the rumble of the gears and the hum of the millstones. We can experience for ourselves a tradition of milling at Worsbrough which stretches back over 900 years.